Okay, you're in.
Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program is number 47 in our series of webinars. And the topic today is a very interesting one, the Zapatistas. We'll be looking at the Zapatistas as a community living at the edge of capitalism and of state power. Indigenous people in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas have been constructing a remarkable community under the banner of Emilio Zapata. The Zapatistas have exited from the state to constitute autonomous, self-governing communities. To a large extent, they've also left the capitalist market economy of the larger society. This is what anthropologist Andrei Grubacek and sociologist Dennis O'Haron, our speakers today, call exilic communities, that is, communities in exile. They have voluntarily left the bad government of the state, mal gobierno, to build a democratic good government. And they've left the competitive individualistic economy to build a cooperative economy based on solidarity and mutual aid. This has required a turning inward, like the shell of a snail. That's why their liberated spaces are called caracolas. The Zapatistas' defiance of both state and capitalism has won the admiration of progressives worldwide. Anarchists and Marxists alike have seen this withdrawal from the modern world as a realization of their highest aspirations. Similarly, the political elite and the ruling classes of Mexico have seen it as a threat to their dominance. Social scientists Andrei Grubacek and Dennis O'Haron analyze the exilic communities with careful, analytic, yet sympathetic minds. Andrei, an anarchist anthropologist, is a professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies and editor of the Journal of World Systems Research. Grubacek previously authored Wobblies and Zapatistas, as well as Don't Mourn, Balkanize. O'Haron is a professor at the University of Texas at El Paso. He's written extensively on Ireland with Inside the Celtic Tiger and Nothing But an Unfinished Song, Bobby Sands, the Irish hunger striker who ignited a generation. Grubacek and O'Haron have collaborated in writing a fascinating book, Living at the Edges of Capitalism, Adventures in Exile and Mutual Aid. Dennis lived for a time in the Zapatista community of Oventec, and their book is really fascinating, contains as a case study a fascinating discussion of the Zapatista um, communities as an exilic adventure. So I want to turn the floor over to Andre, who will speak first, and he will then be joined in conversation by Dennis.
So we were thinking of doing this very informally, and please let me know if you can't hear me. I hope the volume, the sound is good.
It's fine.
To do this, and because there are not too many of us, I think that we can. And in terms of the book, well, I'm very grateful to you, Cliff, for noticing the book and noticing the chapter about the Zapatistas, because originally, when we were conceiving the book and the project itself, we were not thinking about writing about the Zapatistas. We're thinking about writing about what we call the exilic spaces as manifestations of, as you said, certain kind of withdrawal from the world systems, from the capitalist world economy, which is not an anomaly in any way, but is more of a norm, more than most social scientists are actually ready to admit. So in the last couple of years, I have been working on the Kurdish liberation movement, Kurdish freedom movement, as they call it, and especially the project in Rojava, which is in Syria. And I have edited several books about and from Abdullah Öcalan, who is leader of the Kurdish freedom movement. And in one of the most recent ones, which is called Sociology of Freedom, Öcalan actually says that we need if you think about social sciences, the project of social sciences was a social study, he says, of different ways that we are not free. And then he is challenging us to think about social science as a new kind of project, as a project of social study of different ways that we can actually be free. And that, to my mind at least, brings back the admonition from Kropotkin, Peter Kropotkin, who was a big influence, major influence on us in writing this book, who wrote that social scientists need to use all the tools of contemporary anthropology, he called it ethnology at the time, European term, and go back to the past in order to find what is the real relationship between solidarity and conflict. After hearing so much, he said, about things that used to separate us, we need to see and understand the institutions and practices of mutual aid. And his emphasis on mutual aid, as Öcalan's emphasis, of course, on sociology of freedom, was something I think that we took very seriously. And it was a task how to write a history, sociology, anthropology, from the perspective of those experiences that overflow, those experiences that subvert, experiences that are not completely submerged into capitalism. I don't think that we were ever naive. I think that we wanted to, that more than anything else, we were fascinated by the entanglements, about how relationships of hierarchy and domination at the same time are both refused but also reproduced by the relationships of mutual aid, care, and gift. And it was really disheartening to see social scientists not paying almost any attention to all of the ways in which people are able to escape capitalism, which people are able to escape the state. And that is not to say, that is not to even imply that this is a total escape, that this is some kind of a total exit. But it is an important break. And to study how people are able not to allow complete domination of state regulation and valorization through capitalism is something that I think is still, we are at the very beginning of even thinking how to write history, how to write sociology, and how to write anthropology in that way. And the Zapatistas, in that sense, were sort of an obvious place to go and to visit, not only because Dennis lived there, but also because, as you mentioned, they represent an aspiration, political aspiration, of many of the people on the left, not only anarchists, not only Marxists, but also feminists, and also many other people who are interested in seeing how can we overflow the relationships of capitalism, or how can we separate ourselves from the regulative pressures of the state. And in that sense, I think the other two examples that we write about in the book are also very interesting. So those examples are the ones of the Cossacks in Russia. It's a historical example. Don Cossacks were a non-state community, or as we call it, exilic community, that basically seek to exist as a separate community with a political autonomy from the Russian state in the 18th century. And finally, the prisoners, whom we studied both in Turkey, in Ireland, but also in the United States, very unusual place, supermax prisons. And we try to show how in all of these places, we call them instances, we see the same historical dynamic at play. And that is really the topic of our book. Zapatista chapter, in many ways, was the most intimate. The prisoner, at least for myself, Dennis will say how he experienced it. Prisoner chapter was extremely interesting because it illuminated the reality of capitalism as we live it today. And finally, the one on the Cossacks was very interesting because we got to travel and to see the Don Cossacks. We actually went and did something of an ethnography there. And in all of these cases, we were forced to see what I came to call double specification, way of actually understanding the exilic space, the non-state space in capitalism, and understanding capitalism that at that time puts certain constraints on that exilic space, but it is also shaped by it. So that is in many ways the real topic of our book. How capitalism actually produces and reproduces these spaces of exit, and how these exilic spaces at the same time constrain, but also reproduce relationships of capitalism. And the unit of analysis that we have decided to use is world systems, capitalist world economy, and our guides, intellectually speaking, were Immanuel Wallerstein, Fernand Braudel, Marcel Mauss, David Graeber, Peter Kropotkin. So a very unusual cast of characters when put together. But the idea was exactly that, to, in a certain sense, subvert the usual conventional narrative of how we tell history, how we talk about history, but also to put together these, Silvia Federici, whom I forgot to mention, how we divide intellectual and political labor into Marxist analysis, anarchist analysis, feminist analysis. We try to actually put all of these different invaluable insights together, and hopefully with some success. So this is my brief improvisational introduction, and I will now invite Dennis to say a few words.
Thank you, Andre. And let me just kind of follow up on some of the issues he brings up. And I might just add, because I think he's been very important to us, another very, basic force behind our work, which is that of Al Hirschman. And Al Hirschman, which some of you may know and many of you may not, was an economist, a political economist, who worked very much in the mainstream in a way, but was also a critic of capitalism as he worked, and who wrote a very important book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, and also wrote some articles on that. And basically, going from what Andre was saying, I mean, we were also asking a question about, how is it that you actually do this thing of trying to escape from capitalism? If you are trying to create a society or something which is beyond the laws of value as we find them in capitalism, how do you really go about doing that? And we found in Hirschman's work a really kind of interesting guide to that in a sense, because, the obvious thing is that people try and practice exit. And the Zapatistas is a very important process of exit. And as we talk about in our chapter in the book, it's a process of exit which really begins with exile, because of the involuntary exile of Mayan peasants, through the process of land concentration, expulsion, and expulsion into the Lacandon jungle, where really a number of Mayans began to self-organize. Then, of course, came into contact with various generations of Maoists and other Marxists who kind of came in and interestingly listened to the people who were already creating autonomy. And in the process, I think, began to concentrate on the more important facets of their kind of ideological formation. So we see in Subcomandante Marcos, for example, who is, the person that we always hear about, someone who came from Puebla in Mexico, who was forced out of there because of the actions of the state, went into hiding in the jungle and found really a new way of creating politics from below. I think in a way that really had a fundamental change on him. But of course, his participation with the Mayans in the jungle had a important foundational impact on the movement as well. I was there actually in 1988, which is the year of the famous election, the stolen election from Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas, and was around Chiapas for a period of time during that year. And you were already hearing rumblings of things there about what was going on. I mean, it was a very, very interesting time. And, when I left there and went to work in the US for a period of time at the University of Wisconsin, I mean, we would hear more and more and more about what was happening. It was kind of invisible in a way until the uprising on January the 1st of 1994, which was the day, of course, that NAFTA came into being. But, I think it's very, very important that there was kind of this period of forced exile. And it was a period in which the organization had to be self-organization. And also you had a population of people who had traditions and customs, which were very open to self-organization, to something very like what we talk about in the Cossacks, this idea of the Krug. There's always a circle. There's always a kind of self-organized, self-governing body. And in this case, as in the case of the Cossacks, it wasn't so much an ethnic-based group of people, but a group of people who came to believe the same thing. And the thing that was always, for the period of time I was living there, which was in 2002, 2003, around the 10th anniversary of the uprising. The thing that was always said, and you would hear it over and over again, you would say, well, how do you be a Zapatista? Well, you be a Zapatista by having right thinking. And how do you know somebody has right thinking? Because they're here. They wouldn't be here unless they had right thinking. Now, of course, there were instances where people became involved in bad behavior, and there was a justice system and so on and so forth, which dealt with that. But it was a very different kind of justice system. And for me, actually, in 2003, when I was there, having come directly from Belfast, which was still kind of emerging out of a long war, which was a guerrilla war and which included all kinds of justice, revolutionary justice. It was really an eye-opening event to see the new way, not entirely new because many people have done it at many times across history, but to see the new way that that the Zapatistas were thinking about how justice would be done. And of course, it was reformative rather than retributive justice that was being performed. In fact, they told me that that was really the main reason why the state broke down the accords, the peace accords that they were having with the Zapatistas, and refused to take them before the Congress, was because they refused to consider that you could have a different form of justice than the form of justice, of course, which was being practiced by the Mexican state and which is being practiced by practically every state. So getting back to exit, I mean, we began with a form of enforced exit, but which then became a form of voluntary exit, as the group of people who were first in the Lacandon jungle and then in the highlands of Chiapas began to organize their community and to organize self-governance. And this is a process, I think, which is still ongoing today, but one which, you know, the old phrase is we make the road by walking, and they were making that road by walking. And, you know, the other two aspects of what Hirschman talked about, voice and loyalty, I think are important here. One is that the Zapatistas were able to find voice, to exercise voice through exit. And, you know, had they not gone into exile, had they not become an exilic society, they wouldn't have had the same kind of voice that they were able to sort of manufacture and expand as time went on. We can talk more about that if you like. The third thing about loyalty, I think, is one of the most interesting aspects of what we found and talked about with respect to the Zapatistas, because we first looked at the Cossacks in, you know, on the Don River in the Ukraine and in southern Russia. And the Cossacks basically were defeated by a loyalty pact that they made with the Russian government, where they agreed that we will become your army and we will patrol your borders for you in return for you allowing us to remain as a community of Cossacks and, you know, to do the raids and various kinds of things that we do to maintain subsistence. But over time, the Russian government continued, as governments do, as states do, to re-bargain and make new bargains, and every time they did that, the Cossacks lost their autonomy, and they lost their own authority, their own self-governance, and became more and more an arm of the Russian state. This hasn't happened, interestingly, to the Zapatistas, although they haven't been with us for hundreds of years like the Cossacks were, and that was a very long historical process. But the way we've looked at this idea of loyalty is that the Zapatistas refused any kind of loyalty bargain with the Mexican state. And particularly as the talks about the peace accords broke down, they made an explicit statement that, you know, we are not going to bargain with the state. And I remember, we have it in the book, but there was a conversation that I had with some Zapatistas, and they said, yeah, we do everything on our own. We don't take anything from the state. And they said, we have our own, you know, road building, we have our own construction, we have our own food organization, we have factories that manufacture boots and leather goods and clothing and so on and so forth. And I remember saying to them, well, you know, what about electricity? I see lights all around here. How do you get that? And they said, well, we liberate that. So basically, I mean, they were in a form of both autonomous and, I guess, appropriative society, where the things that they needed that they couldn't develop on their own, they appropriated for a period of time. But during that time that I was there, they were in a process of working with a cooperative from southern part of Mexico City. And, you know, they had electricians, electrical workers who were working for the state, who actually came down and were building an electrical grid and generators and so on and so forth, you know, that were donated to the Zapatista communities. So over time, there was a building of autonomy as well, to the degree that they could do that. And then the other part of the loyalty bargain is that they made a bargain with civil society, basically. And this had two sides to it. One side was that, civil society gave support. I think most people thought the Zapatistas would be wiped out by the Mexican army when they rose. And they did have a number of deaths in the, 11 or 12 days that the uprising lasted. And then, whenever the ceasefire was called, I don't think there were many people that really thought the Zapatista movement would survive. But civil society throughout Mexico, first of all, and then throughout the world was I think, important in many ways in putting pressure on the Mexican government not to go in and wipe them out. Now, I think there's some comparative things we might want to talk about later about Turkey and about the Kurds, because there are some really important parallels there. And the Kurds are an example where the state has done everything they could in their power to wipe them out. And it says something about the strength of Kurdish society and of Kurdish social organization, as well as military organization, that they've been able to face up to one of the major military powers in the world. But it was done very differently in Mexico with the Zapatistas. I mean, by garnering support and solidarity among sections of civil society, I think they were able then to show strength in a way that made it very, very difficult for the Mexican government just to go in and kind of wipe them out. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up. Just one other thing, and then we'll kind of go back to a discussion maybe, is to talk a little bit about forms of escape and forms of exit, because one thing we talk about in the book is territorial escape and logical escape. And most of what we're talking about when we talk about exilic societies in our volume, whether it's the Cossacks, the Zapatistas, or prisoners in solitary, is territorial escape. It's actually the building of a territory within which groups of people are able to practice mutual aid and autonomy and self-government or self-governance. But we also want to think more about logical exile or logical escape. And one thing that we have suggested is that we do a lot more of it than we usually think we do. In our daily life, yes, we go to work, many of us, less under COVID, I guess. But, we work for a wage generally. Women do work in the household, but, their work in the household, and men do as well, but primarily women, but their work in the household, while it does, in fact, increase the value of life in the household, that is also incorporated back into capitalism as a way of cheapening the cost of labor through the reproductive work of people in the household and outside of capitalism. But we've kind of called to think more about how we can escape and how we can practice mutual aid in groups and amongst ourselves in our everyday life, and how we can, as capitalism tries to colonize more and more of our everyday life, how can we fight back and recolonize or reappropriate more of the hours of our time, more of our relations with other people in a way that is not governed by the capitalist laws of value. And, we do a lot of things. I always bring up the same example, and Andre probably chuckles whenever I do it, because the Lynn, Stoughton Alice Lind, who Andre has done a lot of work with, and he co-wrote Wobblies and Zapatistas with Stoughton, who is an old Wobbly and an old labor organizer and so on. And they participate in a choir. They're in their 90s, but a couple of times every week they go out and they sing together with comrades, with others who they love, and they're totally self-organized. They figure out, what are we going to sing? How are we going to sing it? who's going to do what, who takes what roles, who's going to do a solo if we have a solo, and so on and so forth. Sporting activities, to the degree that they're not, taken over and commercialized, of course, as many of them are often activities that we're self-organizing, and we are, in fact, doing them as a way of maintaining some form of control over our own lives. So we looked a little bit at some of the biological work, even on forms of activity and the neurons in the brain, and we found out that dancing together, making music together, actually is a way of creating community. And one of the, I think, the basic things that we try to say in the book is that is work. It is work that creates value. Nobody gets paid for it. But when we do this kind of work together, when we sing, when we dance, we're actually doing work at creating community. And we often sweat to do it. We work really hard at it sometimes. And we need to create a new way of thinking that puts value into social relations rather than the value into the economic relations of employment and work. We had another, and I'll just say this and then I'll shut up so other people can talk or ask questions or whatever. We have another person that we worked with, some who was talking about the history of the concept of work in the world system, and Andrea Komlosi. And she made a distinction between opus and Arbeit. She's a German woman. And it's an extremely important distinction to make. Arbeit is toil. And basically, this is the world of capitalism, where our toil is taken over and commodified, and we're paid a wage for it, and it becomes wage labor. Opus is creation. And capitalism has been the increasing division or separation of opus from Arbeit. And I think an important part of all of these societies that we looked at, all of the exilic societies, is the attempt to reconnect through mutual aid, to reconnect opus and Arbeit, so that our toil is also part of our creative activities. And I think if we have one kind of real bottom line in the work that we're doing, that would be certainly one of them. I'll be quiet now and maybe turn it back over to Andre or turn it over to others that want to say anything.
I would like to add, Dennis, to what you were just saying. When at the beginning, I said that the Zapatistas were for me the most intimate one, the most intimate of all the three instances that we were talking about. And the reason is, I come from former Yugoslavia, and I hate calling it former Yugoslavia, I call it Yugoslavia. And I believed very much, and I still do, in both experiments that were central to Yugoslavia. One was Yugoslav self-management, and the other is the idea of what we call bratstvo i jedinstvo, or the international, transnational, trans-ethnic unity, the identity that we built through the anti-fascist struggle during the Second World War. And when Yugoslavia was tossed in this fratricidal civil war in the 1990s, I found myself completely lost. I found myself, as I was telling Dennis at that time, as an exile. I was exiled from Yugoslavia because that was the only country and only identity that I ever, which was non-ethnic identity, the only identity that I always recognized myself, that I was able to accept, really. And then when I found myself in the second exile in the United States, it became even more difficult to try to figure out what on earth happened. But truly, through those exilic experiences of a different kind, there was one thing that I was trying to figure out more than anything else, which is what went wrong with Yugoslavia, with socialist Yugoslavia, with this experiment of an insurgent identity, collective identity, that was supposed to replace the identitarian disintegration of the country that used to be, with all of its faults and problems and shortcomings, a beautiful and exceptional place. And the Zapatistas in those days, and that was 1996, I think, when I discovered the Zapatistas, or 1995 perhaps, in the middle of what we call Dayton Accords, that sort of not exactly ended, but were important in the Yugoslav wars. The Zapatistas were presenting a very different attempt to define identity. What does it mean to belong? What does it mean to actually create a collective identity, insurgent identity that is not ethnically based? How to create a sense of being together, being in common, that is not defined by ethnic boundaries. And that, to me, this idea of different kind of internationalism by creating this kind of what we ended up calling then is, I think, exilic or insurgent identity, and proceeded to identify in all of these instances that we were writing about, was probably the most intimate experience of understanding the Zapatistas. And I was very moved to see the Zapatista delegation that is supposed to arrive in Europe, I think sometimes in August. They just left Mexico on a boat. I think the boat is called the Mountain. I'm not entirely sure. But they're expected to sail to Europe or to maybe land in Spain, I believe, in August. And they had they said, two invitations or two things to say to Spanish people. First, we were never conquered. And second, we don't have to forgive you. Both of these are very powerful. The first one is what we try to say. They truly were never conquered, and they were never completely incorporated, only partially in the processes of capitalist world economy. But on the other note, and this of course is their response to Manuel López Obrador, there is nothing to forgive. That is not how we want to build a collective political identity. We don't want to build a collective political identity on shame, on guilt. We want to build this on passions that we have in common, passions for a different kind of world, for different kind of relationship that needs to be, as we used to say in the 90s, intergalactical, not international, beyond nations, something that actually creates a different kind of understanding. And in that way, the Zapatistas, for me, were a key to exiting the Yugoslav universe, or maybe returning to it in a particular way, by discovering internationalism that can work differently. And this is something that I stumbled upon when doing work in Kurdistan, because they have a specific term for this. They call it democratic nation, but they're really talking about the same thing. A different kind of ethnic belonging that really is escaping the idea of ethnicity, and that creates the nation without a state that then becomes something completely different. And this intergalactical ethos of the Zapatistas, this insurgent collective identity that disrupts these conventional ethnic narratives, like the one that destroyed the country that I come from, is something that for me was deeply intimate, and it continues to be in many ways. I don't know, Dennis, if you want to add anything to this?
I'll be happy to leave it there and maybe turn over to conversation, questions.
Okay.
Conversation is always better than questions, but either are fine.
Well, yes, let's open the floor up to questions or comments that people might have. I need to explain that some people are watching this on YouTube, and they don't have any way of getting questions to us directly. And so if you are on YouTube, you need to send an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will monitor that and pass your questions and comments on to those in the Zoom room. For those who are in the Zoom room, of course, you can present your questions and comments more directly. And I will put us all on gallery view so I can see everybody in the Zoom room. And if you want to say something, you just need to wave at me, and I'll call on you. You can. Why doesn't everybody in the Zoom room put their video camera on so we can see you all? Some people are visible already, but others are not yet. So we'd like to see who's here. And if you want to speak, just wave and then unmute yourself. While people are getting their thoughts together, let me just point out that on that distinction between Arbeit and opus, that's a distinction that was, I thought, very well developed by Hannah Arendt in her book, The Human Condition, where she used the English terminology, labor and work. Labor is toil, work is what creates things. Okay, let's see. There was, Metsu, did I see your hand? Okay, unmute yourself. You can go first.
Thank you. Really nice to hear both of your presentations. Excellent. Dennis, I had a question for you when you raised the issue of women's work and it being kind of outside of the capitalist world. So women have raised the demand for wages for housework to make that point that it is the labor of reproduction for the capitalist system and it needs to be recognized. On the other hand, that demand is also a demand to be incorporated into the capitalist system. So I'm just wondering what you think, how that contradiction should be handled.
Yeah, I think partly, and I don't really have an answer for you, but I'll give you the best answer that I can. That once we begin to look at this in the way that I was looking at it, that we've looked at it, I actually have a picture. I don't know if it'll make a lot of sense, but the picture we use is one of a tree, basically, and in the capitalist system is a tree, the flowering out in the branches of the tree. And this is the way that Fernand Braudel talked about capitalism, is really monopoly capitalism. It's the heights and the productive part of monopoly capitalism is, the branches and the leaves and so on of the tree. But what gives sustenance to the tree, what enables the tree, of course, to live is the roots. And he talks about how capitalism digs its roots into everyday life, or what he calls material life, which is what we're talking about when we talk about, either territorial or logical escape. And as it does that, it is trying to suck the value out of everyday life, which of course includes the household, but also the community and various other ways in which capitalism gets sustenance from material life, from the outside of capitalism, if you will. And, we of course want to find ways to enhance the household, to enhance the community, and particularly to enhance the labor of women in particular, but others who are doing various kinds of what is often called love labor. And if we do that, of course, the irony is that we're also making life much better for the capitalist system by doing that. So the better at which, we can introduce all kinds of labor saving and other kinds of devices into the home, we're not only increasing new products that capitalism can build and sell, but we're also cheapening the cost of the reproduction of labor by doing that. And that's kind of is an essential problem is, how is it that we can enhance material life or everyday life without increasing the amount of sustenance that we provide to the capitalist system? And, that partly begins by having an awareness of the very idea of exilic society, that, when we're enhancing things, that we're not just enhancing it in order to make it easier to live our everyday life at work, but that what we do in our, not only in our houses, but in our communities and so on, has to be working toward some form of liberation. It has to include more relations of mutual aid amongst each other, more ways of self-provisioning, more ways of then creating new activities and valuing them. Going back to the choir, nobody thinks that's work. Well, it is work, damn it. And that goes back to what Cliff was saying about the, Hannah Arendt's version of work. It is opus. And in many cases, it has much greater value. David Graeber talks about that in his book on value, about the way in which a true system of value is, how do we put value on the things that we would do naturally if we weren't being paid to do them? And the things that we would do if we weren't being paid to do them involve community. They involve working together. They involve all of the things that we've had taken away from us over this past year under COVID. And, you know, we're all just, we're champing at the bit to get back together and to be together again. And too often it takes place in the workplace. I mean, I've actually come back to the university. I'm in my university office now. But, you know, more and more, you know, can we go back post-COVID to creating greater and greater relations of mutual aid in ways that increasingly that form of labor is helping us as a community of people who are trying to create exilic relations with the capitalist system, rather than going back into cheapening labor and making, you know, profitability, you know, more maintainable for the capitalist system. I don't know if Andre wants to add to that, maybe.
I mean, the wages for housework, the way that I understood Sylvia and Selma James and other people talking about this, there were, I think it was to a large degree a provocation, intellectual and political provocation, in order to demystify in a certain way the way that we think about capitalism. And I remember how important it was for Maria Mies to write her book on patriarchy and accumulation on a broad scale, when she speaks about the right place of wage labor, and she provides one of the best definitions of capitalism as a conquest of women, labor, and nature, and natives and nature. I can't remember exactly what the definition was, but I remember just enjoying it a great deal. And I think in our journey, anthropologists were very helpful. And some of them were, for example, there is this guy that not too many people know about, Terry Turner, who used to teach at University of Chicago, where he had this endless fights with Moshe Postone about what capital is really about. And these were just wonderful debates. But Terry was an interesting man who never wrote anything, or he wrote very little. That was published. So his students, there was this legendary practice of writing and transcribing his lectures that were later circulated. And the interesting thing about this is we somehow discovered this, Dennis, I can't even remember how, I think David Graeber might have sent it to us, the way that Terry wrote about production. And he was thinking about Marx and how Marx, in a certain sense, stopped short in German ideology, I believe. He said, well, you know, production is this thing that we do all the time, and we are producing exactly the things that Dennis was talking about. And that is really production of people, production of social relations. We produce each other in the we produce what then is called the community, the intersubjective relationships, all of that. And if we think about these economies then become human economies in a certain sense. And then he says, well, but Marx never really went far because he had to debate the bourgeois economist. He had his battle to fight, so to speak. And he never really went to this particular place of developing what does it mean when capitalism actually restricts the definition of production. And this is where I think that some anthropologists, many anarchists, and many feminists actually went to develop those insights provided by Marx in German ideology, and later on in Marx's conversation with Vera Zasulich, which I think for us were also very important, about the way of Russian populists and how can we actually think about what we call capitalism and capitalist modernity and work rather differently. So I think in all of this conversation, it's a fantastic conversation that we found ourselves in. And there were many people, including Raul Zibecki, who is probably familiar to most of you, who writes from Latin America, from Bolivia, I believe, and many others who were trying to understand the logic of these spaces and what is actually happening there. And maybe one thing where we end up being or sounding slightly more pessimistic than some of these friends and comrades, is that we do not think that there is a complete exit. I remember when reading Raoul's book, which was a fantastic book on dispersing power, I felt that he was talking about these exilic spaces. He's using a different term. I think that he's like Jim Scott using the term non-state space. And he was talking about them as if they were disconnected from capitalism. These are places where that exist, that are already completely liberated from capitalism. And that I don't think is what we have discovered in our book. We discovered what you and Dennis were mentioning, this double movement, double relationship of sorts. And in anthropology, you have a whole tradition that begins with Pierre Clastre and then with Jim Scott, James C. Scott, and many others, who are writing also about relationships, about spaces, about economies that are outside of capitalism, but they're writing about them as sort of pre-capitalist. So again, we have this linear relationship, developmentalist relationship, something that sort of pre-existed capitalism, and they don't really have a way of formulating what is going on once the capitalism comes in. And I think one of the novelties of our work is how we are actually trying to understand what happens to these non-state spaces, as they're called in anthropology, once we emplace them within world capitalism. How is capitalism transformed, and how are these non-state spaces transformed? Are they still non-state spaces, or do they become something else? And this is where we are back to this conversation between Moshe Postone and Terry Turner. How do we really think about capitalism? Is it a totality that begins sometime in 16th century or whenever we want to actually start counting? Or is it something that we can actually think about not as a totality, but as a development that goes back to 12th century and the times when opus and arbeit were the things that people were actually, Andrea Komlosy and others were discussing?
Yeah, just to add to that too, I mean, to get back to the topic of the Zapatistas, when anybody who's spent any time in San Cristobal or, around Chiapas or Tabasco or the parts where they've organized, it's very clear that, you run into a lot of particularly men, but also women from the communities in towns and cities. And they also try and migrate to the US. And there are, big contradictions involved in an exilic society, particularly in maintaining the sufficiency of the community. So they have cooperative coffee plots, for example, which then go into the international market and so on. And they have to be drawn in to the market, both in terms of the products that they produce, surplus products, which then become commodified, but also in terms of the labor of many of their young people who, frankly, how are you going to keep them down on the farm in Oventique after they've seen Paris, and they do, in fact, have to face the attraction of going into the big city and the many things that are available there, including, there's no alcohol allowed in the communities. But I've drunk many a drink with a Zapatista in San Cristobal and other places. So, there are these things that are continually tearing the community apart. And, you can't live in total isolation from the capitalist system, as Andre was saying. I mean, there's both market and other cultural and other forces, which are kind of picking at the community all the time and making it very, very difficult to kind of maintain the community. And really, they have to, in order to, so that people have medicines, food. One of the interesting things I think that a lot of Europeans, especially in the sort of support communities, got wrong was they thought that the Zapatista movement was all about identity. And they would go on and on about it. And I remember reading a beautiful speech by Comandante Ramona, and who unfortunately later died of cancer, but a really wonderful woman. And she said, "Why do we do this? We do this because so many of our women die in childbirth. We do this because, you know, our people are starving. We do this because we're forced to have our education in Spanish and to do the kinds of education that they want us to do. So the idea that this was somehow not a material movement, I think was one of the sort of key things that, you know, that we found as we looked at Zapatista society, both in a good and a bad way. It's very much about increasing or improving the material life of the communities in Chiapas and elsewhere, but it's also about the material necessities that one has to go through. And quite often you have to make compromises. Even when you claim that you're creating an autonomous society and you don't take anything from the Mexican government, you do.
And I think this is really, really important to say because, you know, I guess some people could say that we are making Zapatistas seem too strategic in a sense. But I think what we try to do is to take them as real people having a real struggle. And they were trying, and they are trying to survive. And when you're trying to survive, it's very hard to be kept to moral standards of purity that many people in the United States and Europe seem to expect from people who find themselves in struggle. So when we talked about the Cossacks, we talked about, as Dennis explained, loyalty bargain that they made with the state. And then we talked about the Zapatistas, and there was a loyalty bargain made by extra non-state actors, in this case, international and national, of course, civil society. And then, you know, now studying the Kurdish experiment in Rojava, social revolution in Rojava, there is again a loyalty bargain with the state. And none of this is stable. All of this, they have to figure out ways to survive. And it's very easy to pass recommendations or condemnations from, you know, from Zoom rooms and Zoom chat rooms. But these people actually are to be taken seriously. And I remember having a conversation that was borderline unpleasant with somebody who told me, I don't even know if I shared it with Dennis, that we were making the Zapatistas too eclectic, too strategic, at the detriment of their political purity, of their political ideology. And I remember I just didn't feel good about that conversation because I think that what we try to do is exactly to take them seriously. And when we wrote that they inhabit this contradictory location that is in and outside of capitalism, in and outside of the state in a particular way, and that this is far more useful to study shortcomings, to study things that are not ideal or perhaps less ideal than they might appear, is something that we can do as social scientists, and it's a very good thing, I think. And I don't think that in that sense we try to transform Zapatistas into something that they're not. So I don't know if this is helpful. We went a long way from the original question, but hopefully we were able to say something about labor. And
let me give a little example, actually, one that was going on, you know, when I was there and throughout the early periods of the movement. You know, there was this problem of the lands that had been expropriated basically from Mayan communities by ranchers and so on, and by the attempts of the Mexican state to do away with Article 27 of the Constitution and basically privatize what were called the ejidos, the communal lands that were guaranteed by the Mexican Revolution. And, you know, there was a huge debate within the Zapatista community. What do we do about this? And eventually they decided, we will take these cases to the Mexican courts. We will argue the rightness of the ejido. We will defend the ejido in the Mexican courts. And, you know, there were people both from within and without, but unfortunately, all too often from without, that criticized the Zapatistas for not being pure enough by taking their struggle into the Mexican courts. Well, they won. They actually went in and they got their land back and they won their fight within the Mexican courts. And I don't think it fundamentally changed the nature of the struggle. It didn't turn them into all of a sudden, you know, toadies of the Mexican state or something like that. But it actually enabled them to attain a small victory without making any fundamental, change or compromise on kind of the fundamental principles of what being a Zapatista and creating a Zapatista community was all about. So I think that was a really interesting example of sometimes, you have to dip your toe in the waters of capital or in the capitalist state to achieve some of the things that you need to achieve. And in this case, I don't know how they would have got their land back otherwise. It worked.
Melissa Young had her hand up earlier. Let me call on Melissa.
Hi. I just really wanted to thank you for your presentation and this perspective on these various examples. And it kind of makes me reflect on the community work that I am seeing in my own semi-rural community here on Whidbey Island, Washington, and just how important the interrelations with people. People are volunteering around a school farm, around various other aspects, now trying to create some community housing. How important those kinds of interrelationships are, even though they're not totally separate, say, not a separate organization from the capitalist culture we live in. And it also makes me reflect on our documentary work. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and we've done a lot of work in different places around the world. And we're currently working on some projects that have to do with the interrelationships among things like co-ops, unions, community organizations in some places around the United States, as ways of creating strong localities and the possibilities for a more equitable, building somewhat more equitable system in local areas. And so it's your presentations have given me some things to think about. But my question, I visited Chiapas several years ago. We do speak Spanish. We do not speak the local languages there. And we were very impressed and interested and so on. So given the topic of the webinar, we were interested to kind of get if there's some way to give some kind of update on how you view what's happening in Zapatista land currently.
Andre, do you want to go on that, or do you want me to go?
It's really interesting. In terms of what's happening currently, I think the most interesting is this, the trip to Europe. And I just sort of surreally, miraculously, I just received a message from John Holloway, who is one of their most, I think, interesting comrades or friends, companions of Zapatistas on their journey. And I'm just going to read this. He's sending this, and he said this is going to be published tomorrow somewhere. But I just love this, the way that he writes about this. And I'm just going to read this very quickly. He says, the Zapatista trip is reaching out to hold hands, not to guide, but to share. A holding of hands, a reciprocal flow of energies, a spark perhaps. An interchange of distinct experiences on the common struggle to kill the hydra of capitalism. A learning that is teaching, a teaching that is learning. Not just an improvised interchange, but a deepening of the interchanges that have existed for many years. And then he says, surreal, certainly. The surrealism of the Zapatista journey is no ornament. It goes to the heart of the Zapatista politics. Time and time again, the Zapatistas have surprised us with their initiatives, but this is perhaps the most wondrous of all. In the middle of the pandemic, and without signing any contract with Netflix, They have created a most astonishing piece of theater, making the Atlantic Ocean their stage, and then spreading to 30 or so different geographies in Europe. And this is to push revolutionary thought to a place it has never gone before. It is to take the struggle for life and against capitalism, for the struggle for life must be a struggle against capitalism, to a newly surreal dimension. And the surrealism is crucial because it breaks the logic of capital and its state that drags and drags and drags our dreams or something better into a reproduction of the same system of death. Always useful because he's always so poetic. Dennis and myself try to be social scientists about it, at the expense perhaps of poetry, but I think that both approaches do justice to the Zapatistas and what they're doing today. I think what John is writing about here in what I've just read is what Dennis and myself called exilic communication. Exile can be a strategy. And there is a beautiful part by Subcomandante Marcos in one of his many beautiful writings when he talks about bridges and how Zapatismo is a bridge. It is a way to create kinds of communication that goes beyond the old socialist dilemma. Namely, if you think about what in my country, at least, we used to call socialism in one country or socialism in one factory. I don't know if the United States had similar expressions, probably did. You know, we did not want to write about socialism or Zapatismo or whatever we want to call this beautiful experiment in one exilic space. We wanted to see how this contagion, how this contamination, how this exilic communication can translate into different contexts. We actually thought about it as a political strategy. And I think this is what, to the question of what the Zapatistas are doing today, I think that they have secured a space in which we have several generations now. And this again brings me back to Yugoslavia and self-management. We had at least 3 generations growing up in a very different systems, very different value system, going to a very different kind of schools, experiencing very different kind of social relations. And in Chiapas now we have how many years? 30 years, or even more, 40, of actually doing exactly that. We have people who were born into this new society. And now that experience is traveling on these boats. It's being communicated. It's being taken to other places, as John says, not to be taught, but to be shared. And there is something truly new politically in the way that this has been done. And exile in that sense, it's not only a strategic defensive mechanism. Exile also is a kind of politics, exilic politics, politics of mutual aid, if you will, of gift, that the Zapatistas are perhaps the most beautiful, most accomplished, together with the Kurds, contemporary example of. So I think that the most that is happening in Chiapas right now, and I think it's more than enough, is this continual struggle to survive by making sure that firmaments of autonomy, of what they call autonomy, is something that is becoming stronger rather than weaker, that pressures to incorporate or maybe reincorporate them into the systems of capital and state is being refused or minimized. And on the other hand, one part of doing so is communicating. And this spark that John is talking about is their idea that they cannot exist on this island of Chiapas. They have to create bridges, they have to create boats, they have to communicate and try to somehow, using the spark, iskra, right? Go back to that idea of a global social movement, that they were very much a primary mover in the 90s. So I think that is the idea of the Zapatistas, this realization right now that Chiapas is not an island, or even if it is, what we need to create is an archipelagus, and we need to create this, anarcho-communists used to call this, and the Kurds again today, confederalism. A confederal relationships of all of these misfitting spaces, of self-determining spaces that are balkanizing, if you will, from the systems of capital and the state as right now. So I think this is where they're putting most of their energy on, after something that Dennis perhaps can tell you more about, which is their attempt to be involved in the presidential elections, which was yet another attempt to reach out and to share.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of that as you were talking, Andre, because, you know, one of the big debates that happened, and a lot of Zapatista supporters, I mean, John Ross, for example, the journalist who unfortunately is no longer with us, but wrote a lot about the Zapatistas, really came into conflict with them over the previous AMLO campaign, when he didn't win the presidential election, unlike this time. But they have consistently refused to become involved in that form of politics by, you know, even though maybe AMLO was seen at the time as being more progressive than the alternative, you know, they made a very strong argument that no, this is not the way that we should go. And I think a lot of people wanted to blame them for AMLO's loss the previous time around. But, you know, now we've seen AMLO in action, and I think probably we see, maybe some of us have a more positive reaction to the Zapatistas' refusal, because it's probably something that you know, many of us would not want to be a part of. Certainly has been a disappointing example of progressivism in action, if we want to call it that. So yeah, they've consistently refused to be drawn into that form of electoral politics. And you know, we all face these things all the time. I do remember that, you know, one of the things I was impressed by, though, was what was his name? Rubin. He wrote the book Strike. Jeremy
Brecker.
Jeremy Brecker. No, it wasn't Jeremy Brecker. It was another guy. But they asked him, you know, he was going to vote for Jimmy Carter back when Carter was running against Gerald Ford, I think it was. That's ancient history. And I remember him saying something that I thought was very interesting, because people were really jumping at him for doing it. And he said, voting is the least important political thing I do. And, you know, we get so caught up in elections and all that kind of stuff without doing the kinds of things that we're talking about here, which is about how we live our lives as political lives. You know, and Melissa was talking about that as well. You know, as the jets were flying over at Whidbey Island. You must get sick of that. I know I have when I've been around there. But you know, this is everyday politics. This is the more important thing that we do, is we work with this opus at building community and building what we have referred to as a logical exilic society, you know, in the midst of that. And you know, all of the other things that AMLO and Joe Biden and all of those people are doing, of course, have a very, very big impact on the things that happen and the kind of environment in which we try and do those things. And some are better than others, but it's a different form of politics. And I think the Zapatistas have explicitly chosen not to be a part of that, and to be a part of an exilic politics, which is really something different.
5 years ago or so, the Center for Global Justice had a conference under the title Moving Beyond Capitalism. The idea behind it was that there are nooks and crannies within existing society where we can begin to create alternatives to the dominant practices of capitalism. And that conference brought very positive response from many people who found that that in our everyday life, there are ways in which we can, and in fact, we quite commonly do practice in non-capitalist ways. And to some extent even outside of state control. We put that conference together in a book by that title, Moving Beyond Capitalism. And that led us to thinking also about a lot of the literature about commons. And commons hasn't been mentioned, but there is this book, for example, The Wealth of the Commons, A World Beyond Market and State. That is, there are practices within existing society that are neither state nor market, but operate according to a different logic. And I'm just, and I wanted to ask you whether these kinds of practices have potential for a political strategy to move beyond capitalism in a much more, total way. They are prefigurative practices that keep alive within our imaginations the possibilities of a different world, of a different life, and can the maintenance of this imagination have political traction?
Cliff?
Okay, yeah, Lisa has joined us.
Hi.
Lisa Servin, Mexican historian.
Well, thank you for your talk. I just would like to put some context on why the Zapatistas are traveling to Europe. I mean, I think it's a beautiful idea of how a beautiful example of how you break with the states, in the sense that they have been, since López Obrador took power, they have been surrounded by lots of violence. There's a lot of violence going on right now in the area. They have armed groups, paramilitares, who are all the time sort of provoking something. And what I think is fantastic and beautiful is how the Zapatistas, this idea they have of breaking with boundaries, breaking with frontiers, breaking with the state violence, is to sail to Europe. I mean, it's not sailing to Europe. It's building with the trees from the jungle, building a boat and breaking the border, breaking the limit that the state is trying to put on them. I'm sorry for my English. I haven't talked in English in a long time. I hope I'm being clear. I mean, what really makes me think about how imagination and how they're all the time sort of moving forward, breaking with the state, breaking with with the state violence in a beautiful way, and connecting and building community and building this sort of confederation with people from all over the world, only by portraying the idea of traveling and sharing. And I mean, it's just fantastic. And it really, I think, opens the mind for the left. I mean, I would just finish by having this sort of this idea that I have in my mind. As far as I know, they are. As far as I know, they are about to get to Cuba. They are about to get to Cienfuegos. And, you know, this contrast between what Cuba is or has been for certain left and the Zapatistas arriving to Cuba, it's really such a changing time for the left. That's, it's not a question, it's more like a comment. And thank you for your work.
Thank you, Elisa. And I'd like to just say a few things about what you've been talking about, because, I against my better judgment, became a dean, and I came to El Paso and took a job as a dean of the College of Liberal Arts, which I swore I'd never even be a chair of the department. Here I am, a dean. But the wonderful thing, which scared me at first, is that in liberal arts here, we have fine arts as well as the humanities and social sciences. And one of the things that we've been supporting, and I've been able to help these things come about, are some projects which basically try to make the border invisible. I can literally walk out of this office and in 5 minutes, I will be at the wall. And, I can see it out my window. And this is the reality, unfortunately. And, I don't know anybody. I do know some people, but the vast majority of people in El Paso mourn the fact that we cannot just go back and forth to Juarez, and that our friends in Juarez, our neighbors, because we are one city, cannot come back and forth. But one thing that we do is, and this is a form of exilic activity of the type that we're talking about, is, that we've been supporting various projects that try to make the wall invisible, that try to break down the wall. And I was just in Bisbee a couple of weeks ago working with an artist there who is making these things called border crossers. And they're platforms that have balloons on them that they fill with air, and they go to a magnificent height. And we went down to the border in Naca, which is just, to the south of there, where Trump has built 3 walls, basically. These are the walls he built, are not new walls, but, 3 different walls in the same place around this little, 10,000 people village. But what he's built is this thing where we will soon, over the next year, and COVID has kind of held it up, have people from the community on the Mexican side and the community on the US side come together, and these border crossers with, communities of people will reach across the wall and basically make it invisible. Last year, we had a project of a similar kind where we had light, which came together. And when the lights came together, they created a circuit which enabled people to talk to each other from Juarez and El Paso. And families then came together, and communicated. And basically, at least for a moment, and more than in a symbolic way, we obliterated the wall. And, those are the kinds of I think, exilic activities that we can do. And the fact that we can even do it, within the confines of an American university, I think is pretty fantastic. And, we find ourselves in very restricted situations, but you're absolutely right. I appreciate what you said, because this example of what the Zapatistas, can do, which is above and beyond what, mere states are doing, I think is really fabulous. And that really does put it into some context.
Let me just say something to Cliff's question that was before, and to the most recent question we got on in the chat section. I think that are sort of related. As Dennis says, even despite the confines of the university system, I remember when I found myself in San Francisco, Bay Area, I was looking for a place. I got basically unceremoniously invited to leave University of San Francisco for all sorts of reasons. And then I was just looking for a place where I can study exactly those spaces, Cliff, that you're talking about, that are moving beyond capitalism. And I went from one university to another until I found a university here called California Institute of Integral Studies. And I offered them to create a department of anarchist anthropology that would look specifically into these spaces of commoning and these activities. And instead of, I was expecting them to tell me that I'm completely insane. However, they were very, very nice. And they told me, yes, why not? We don't think that anybody else is doing this. And you know, they're right. There is not a single university in the United States in terms of departments that actually is studying places that are moving beyond capitalism. I think that the department that we have created here in San Francisco is the only one that is completely and solely focused on these experiences. But these experiences are complicated and contradictory, and I'm going now to the question here about exilic culture in libertarian United States, which is a really great question, because there is a friend that we have whose name is Raymond Crape, and he just finished writing a book called Adventure Capitalism, which was supposed to be a response to our book, or perhaps in addition to it, called Negative Exit, but he ended up calling it Adventure Capitalism. And he's talking about all of these people who would like to live in capitalism, but without the state. And he was able to find, I read I don't know if Dennis had the time to read the draft, but he is going through all of these examples of they're fascinating, of these exilic, to an extent, territories that are Minerva Republic, Charter City in Honduras. There's so many of them. Peter Thiel is the name of that gangster who owns PayPal and some other things here in the United States. And he is unfortunately still at large, and he is doing all sorts of terrible things, including something called Seasteader Initiative. Something basically that is creating boats, a very rough equivalent to what used to be a very beautiful exilic experience of an Atlantic pirate ship that Marcus Rediker writes about. He is creating boats that are outside of the sovereignty of states, that are the hub of unbridled activity of entrepreneurs who are, brilliant and all of that. So there is this whole way of taking it to the sea, of these exilic, of this libertarian right-wing culture, and doing all of those things that we would really not like to see as an exilic prefigurative model for future society, all of a sudden appearing at different islands in different places, again in Latin America, or at least so I've heard, Central America. So there is an activity of actually institutionalizing this particular negative exilic culture in these spaces. Now, I think Dennis and myself had that question very early on. Do we treat these spaces as exilic? Do we really wanted to move away from the romanticism of an exilic space and to always think about it as this beautiful island of hope? We wanted to go deep into the contradictions of these spaces. But I think that for us, exilic space is, after all, a sort of concentrated site of relationships of mutual aid that stands away at some distance from both capitalism and the state. And it itself creates what Cliff, I think, asked about, a sort of a political statement and even political strategy. And I think that makes the kind of experiments that we are talking about, which are not just experiments, regular historical instances that keep occurring through the history of capitalism, different than the US libertarian culture that is now going, in a certain sense, global, or at least it's becoming transoceanic. I don't know, Dennis, if you want to add anything to this, but I don't think that I think that we were talking about Brazilian gangs, and we're talking about different ways that these centralized experiences exist without the hierarchical organizing authority of the state. But to what extent are these spaces exilic?
Yeah, it does bring up the question, which I think we were never really able to answer, except that we're working in a basic model that all of history is a kind of a struggle between the institutions of possessive individualism, which are imposed on us by states and by capitalism, and practices of mutual aid. And, to look at capitalism in that way is a different way to look at it. But to get back to what Andre is saying, I mean, why is it that this emerges in Chiapas? Why is this kind of a positive experience happening? And, I've been thinking, for some time, I was living for a period of time in Turkey. And, what was the response to Kemalism when Kemalism, which set itself up as a progressive, republic, but failed to deliver the goods, basically, which is what the Mexican state did. They failed to deliver the goods. But the answer in Turkey was, this awful authoritarian Islamic state, which has emerged under Erdogan, or even, in the Palestinian territories, the emergence of Hamas, because the Palestinian Authority didn't deliver the goods. So why is it that sometimes the state fails to deliver the goods, and we have the kind of, movement from below, as we see in the Zapatistas and now in Rojava, versus, the response, which is really a response to support various kinds of authoritarian so-called populists, but of course they're not, movements. And the origins of, I think, of exilic societies is something that maybe we or historians could do a lot more work on.
Well, we're running short on time. I'd like to take maybe one more question. But before we do that, Dave Graeber's name has been mentioned several times, and there is going to be a tribute to him tomorrow that some of you would be interested in. Andre, do you want to tell people about that?
Yes, so we are doing the first David Graeber Memorial Lecture. David Graeber was an anthropologist and a friend who died recently in September. And this is a co-production between our department at California Institute for Integral Studies, now University of Rojava, which is very interesting, because they are doing this new, all sorts of interesting programs. So if you want, please, if you have time, see what they are doing. They have some wonderful projects. And the university in Puebla, Boab. And we are together tomorrow doing something that I'm going to repost here, which is the memorial lecture given by Dr. Alpa Shah, who is a professor of anthropology, but she was also a former Naxalite. And I assume most of you know what that is, but the Indian Maoist group, a Maoist group located in India. And she did a lot of writings about them. And the most interesting one is the book called Night March, in which she is talking about all the political ways and lifestyles and history of Indian Maoists. So she's the only one who actually was granted access to write about this and permission to write about them. So she's going to be talking about Naxalite democracy, then liberal democracy, and what she is in favor of, which is democracy by sortition. And she is going, of course, to talk about the Zapatistas, among others. And I'm going to post again a way for you to register here in the chat section. This is again tomorrow, 9 a.m. my time. I'm not entirely sure what that is in, that should be 10 o'clock in Mexico, right? Central Mexico.
I think it's 11, actually. I think Mexico's on Central Time, right?
Yes.
I believe so, yes.
Yes, yeah. Or 12 Eastern time.
There
A
you
lot
go.
of people's mindset is East time zone. So that information is in the chat box. And even after we leave the chat box, I'm going to leave it open for a while because there's a lot of very interesting information that has come in the chat box, and those who haven't. But
Cliff, I think you were cutting out.
Yes, I was. Am I back now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I have an internet connection. But do we have, there was some,
Stephen has had his hand up for a long time.
Do we still have time? Is it still going on?
Fire away, but Andre has to give a short answer.
I have a big question.
Okay.
Just for Dennis and Andre, you've been thinking about this for a long time, and I just wondered if you're willing to speculate a little or give your views on what the prospects are for moving beyond capitalism globally. How do you see it, and what kind of global mobilizations might be needed to do that?
I can be brief. It's a monumental question. But I think there is I would say translation. There are so many examples right now of people trying to what Samir Amin used to call de-link from capitalism. And I think that what we have to do then is to bring back this delinking that Amin was talking about with this old ideas that now resurfacing again of confederalism. And we have in Rojava this new initiative for world confederalism, which I think is very good, which basically means circulation of all of these exilic experiences, translation of what Zapatistas are doing right now, right? Introducing each other with what we are doing and creating connections between these different exilic ruptures and exilic experiences. I think that kind of world confederation is probably the way, it would be my preferred way of exiting capitalism. And then in the process of doing so, we will figure out what that exactly mean and entail.
I agree with Andre. I mean, I'm very positive and optimistic. I mean, because we have to, but we will. I'll give two quotes from Marxists who perhaps would have a different way out than we're proposing here. One was Paul Sweezy, who one time in a conversation said, you know, capitalism tried to establish itself many times. It took hundreds of years, and they failed over and over and over again. But finally, capitalism became the dominant system. And, you know, Sweezy was very optimistic that some form of communism would emerge, and probably his vision of what it was somewhat different from us, although in many ways similar. The other person I would quote, famous Marxist, is Fidel. History will absolve us. You know, and again, with a different idea, but history is a long, long time, and we will happen, but we have to work at it, you know. And I think the things that Andre and I have been talking about are the ways that we're convinced by trying to reinforce, you know, real relations of mutual aid to the greatest degree possible, and do them in a way, as we talked about earlier, that doesn't simply reinforce capitalism, but creates a way out of capitalism. I think it's really the only way to go. I'm done.
well, I think fitting closing words from our two speakers as we wrap up this
Is it only me who can hear Cliff?
No, we're all in the dark here.
I think he's gone.
Folks, I have to go on to another engagement, but
can hear me.
thank you so much. We really enjoyed talking to you today.
Okay.
Wonderful. Oh, we do have Cliff back now, so he can.
All right. Sorry. Well, I just want closing thanks to Andre and Dennis for their rich conversation, and this will be on our website. It's been recorded, and so it will be available for viewing later, or if you want to recommend it to others. We also have on our website the webinar we had with Sylvia Federici on feminism that was also of interest, I'm sure, to many of those who are with us today. I want to give a heads up to our next webinar. Next Monday will be Religion as a Force for Social Justice, a talk by Michael Rivage-Soul and David Schweikert, who was with us today. You may have noticed him, but that will be next Monday. And hope you will join us. Let me also give thanks to our webinar team, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamant, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, and yours truly. And with that, I will sign off, but leave the chat open for a while if you want to draw information from that. Thank you, one and all.
Hasta luego.